I would like to introduce Martin Porter. Martin Porter has been an environmental activist for most of the last 25 years and has shared a police cell with Greenpeace Director Peter Melchett and been Swampy's spin doctor. He has campaigned against the building of the Newbury bypass and the second runway at Manchester Airport, and was part of the successful Greenpeace campaign to stop the growing of GM crops. More recently, he has been campaigning against fracking and organized the Manchester People's Climate March. He has a degree in astrophysics and is a social worker by profession. Martin, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Now I'm going to try and speak whilst clicking a PowerPoint, which might be rather more than I can do at once. Okay, here we go. Are we off? Right, okay, thank you very much. So starting off with essentially an activist perspective of what's been going on. Okay, the world is facing a crisis. The latest version of the famous hockey stick climate graph that you can see shows the recent warming is unprecedented in at least the last 24,000 years. But climate change is not the only threat the world faces. Biodiversity loss is also unprecedented and has not been seen at this pace for thousands, if not millions of years. But unlike climate change, it does not feature quite so often in international conferences, and scientists aren't confident making predictions or telling us exactly where the future tipping points are. We are also warming the planet and wiping out other species while simultaneously failing to meet the basic needs of a large proportion of our fellow human beings. The world desperately needs a solution to this crisis. The United Nations Conference of the Parties, now in its 26th iteration, was supposed to be the answer, but the evidence for this is slim. The treaties and accords the world's leaders have agreed, whilst trying to solve the problem of climate change, pretty much tracks the rising global temperatures. Another 26 will be well and truly fried. Even the one COP that almost everyone agrees achieved something, number 21 in Paris, has yet to stop the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rising. Even if the nations of the world uphold their non-binding pledges, the Earth is expected to warm by more than 3 degrees by 2100. That is twice what scientists believe is the maximum safe amount of warming, with safe being very much a relative term. So faced with a highly likely end of the biosphere as we know it, and quite likely as well what passes for human civilization, it's not surprising there's been a considerable resistance from civil society. The environment movement is older than concerns about the climate. Its cultural origins lie in a romantic and existential artistic movements of the late 19th century. But its usual birth date is given as the 28th of May, 1892, when the Sierra Club was formed and started to preserve what was left of the American wilderness. The modern environment movement, meanwhile, dates from the 27th of September, 1962, when the scientist Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. This seminal work, mainly focusing on pesticides and herbicides, changed the focus of the movement from the preservation of wild places, often as not for the enjoyment of rich men, to challenging modern industrial civilization and looking at the global impacts of it on the Earth. A number of groups and campaigns sprung up in its aftermath, including Friends of the Earth, formed by a disillusioned Sierra Club staffer in 1969. Climate change, though, was not an early concern for the environment movement. It was scientists that first raised the alarm. Friends of the Earth was the first organisation to take the threat seriously. For most of the 80s, they attempted to address the problem at an elite level. But after climate scientist James Hansen addressed the US Senate in 1988, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1989, environmental groups started to campaign publicly on the issue. The response to the climate crisis by the environmental movement therefore paralleled the COP process. These separate tracks would converge geographically whenever there was an important international convention. Copenhagen 2009, Paris 2015, Glasgow 2021, and so on. But for the most part, they had very little to do with one another. The environment movements had been campaigning against coal and oil before climate change concerns escaped from the world of science, with the issues being spills, air pollution, and destructive mining. Although the different groups had developed their individual methods and tactics, they mostly shared a similar strategy. This was focus on one particular issue, make it public with stunts and direct action, and then get the public on board so they can pressure decision makers for change. This division of the problem into myriad bite-sized chunks contrasts with the COP approach, which aims for a single agreement to solve the whole problem for the whole world. This dichotomy is interesting as to a certain extent it has the two groups essentially acting against type. The capitalist nations of the world are attempting a fair and equitable solution, whereas if the eco-warriors were to suddenly succeed in every single one of their campaigns, it would usher in a Mad Max-style world of oil and energy shortages and chaos. So what is the relationship between the environment movement and the United Nations process? Are the COPs merely an opportunity for the environmental groups to put on a demonstration and a place where the media will notice them? The simple answer is probably yes. The world's leaders come and go, the protesters protest, an agreement of sorts is reached, then each go their separate ways. The world leaders move on to the next crisis and the environmentalists to their next target, the twain to meet again in another 5 years. This point is really important to reiterate before I move on. The COP process and environmental campaigning are two distinct ways in which the world has responded to the climate crisis. And there is really very little overlap in the two beyond a stated desire for the same outcome. COP exists within the framework of the international relations following the Second World War. The United Nations has clearly had many successes and is obviously an improvement on the way the world was run prior to 1945. So why the UN does what it does doesn't really need an explanation. The limits of the UN approach are obviously that its greatest success to date, the Paris Agreement, will still lead to a catastrophic degree of warming. The environment movement has a completely different way of operating. Friends of the Earth was formed because the Sierra Club was seen to be not robust enough in its campaigning. In 1971, Greenpeace added boats on the principle of putting your body where your mouth is to the mix. And in 1979, Earth First became the template for a myriad of do-it-yourself grassroots groups. All these groups have many successes behind them, from saving the whale to ending fracking in the UK. The problem is the climate crisis. Winning slowly is effectively the same as losing. With so much fossil fuel to keep in the ground, the tactics of tackling a problem one mine, oil well, or fracking rig at a time seem inadequate. It's this frustration with the pace of change from traditional environmental campaigning that has led to the formation of Extinction Rebellion and its offshoots. Perhaps the only thing environmentalists and COP really have in common, though, is that they both seem doomed to failure. There is more to the story than that. The protests that follow the negotiators around the world, which have been some of the largest environmental gatherings since the original Earth Day in 1970, do have some effect on the negotiations, although it's important not to overemphasize this. The protests that accompanied COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009 failed to save the summit from failure. By contrast, in Paris 6 years later, a state of emergency severely limited protest, and the biggest demonstration of all didn't take place until after the agreement had been signed. Yet the summit was still a relative success. Street demonstrations at COPs have never had the impact of, for example, the Battle of Seattle in 1999, which effectively ended that World Trade Organization meeting, pushed the term anti-globalization into the public domain for the first time, and encouraged many countries in the global south to complain about the inequities of the WTO system. Although negotiators may have been inspired by the demonstrators outside, and maybe by the representatives of green groups inside, this is no more than mild lobbying. The fossil fuel industry, meanwhile, was engaged in hard lobbying and had a larger delegation at COP26 than any single nation. Even less quantifiable is the extent to which persistent campaigning on green issues between COPs and a steady stream of news headlines and angry letters from voters influences politicians to take the environment seriously. What is slightly easier to discuss is the extent to which campaigning alters the agenda of the COPs. As I said above, in some ways, politicians and activists are both playing against type in their different tactics, but this is not completely true. International negotiations aim to make everyone a winner. But as this is rarely possible, a degree of bullying goes on. In this fight, not everyone is equal, and it's dollars that count. The nations that contributed most to climate change by their emissions also aim to benefit the most from the agreement to limit them. To bring equality back into negotiations, was the principal aim of the coalition of groups that came together for COP26 in Glasgow. At the big march in Scotland and also the regional marches that had been organised in case COVID travel restrictions prevented the Glasgow march going ahead, the theme was climate justice. Speakers were chosen to represent the global south. In Manchester, the march and rally I was involved in organising, the majority of our speakers were people of colour from trade unions or refugee activist groups. In Glasgow, Greenpeace used the Rainbow Warrior 3 to bring youth activists from Uganda, Namibia, Mexico and Bangladesh to COP26. And around the country, Greenpeace groups snuck out in the night to stick up posters with messages from people on the front line of the climate crisis. How much of this message got through to the general public is questionable. The press coverage was poor and largely pre-written. In Manchester, the BBC used a recorded interview with school children, and the Manchester Evening News based its entire coverage on a picture of two white protesters carrying placards that was shown in a Friends of the Earth tweet. That's seriously what they did. However, the marches do seem to have had their effect. Harjeet Singh of the Climate Action Network, a delegate at COP26, believes that it was pressure from the outside that led to the USA agreeing to discuss loss and damage, one of the main mechanisms of climate justice, for the first time. Now, it's one thing we've learned from 26 COPs is that talking about something and doing something about it are two very different things, but it is progress. The issue of fossil fuels is another example of influence from the outside. In order to prevent climate catastrophe, we need to keep most fossil fuels in the ground. This is not really disputed and is what most environmental campaigners focus on. And yet, in the first 25 COPs, there was no mention of fossil fuels at all. Finally, in COP26, there was a mention of a fossil fuel in the final agreement text. It only talks about an accelerated phase down of unabated coal power, but still, it's progress. Now, the UK was actually able to go to Glasgow, showing a degree of leadership, mainly thanks to key successes in campaigning by Greenpeace, climate camps and other groups, which had ended the use of coal power in UK power stations. Unfortunately, just before the summit, the UK government gave its approval to the Cambo oil field west of Shetland, which could be one reason why oil wasn't mentioned. The UK also hosted the Glasgow summit as something of a world leader in the field of offshore wind energy. This was almost entirely down to pressure from civil society on a reluctant governments. Offshore wind, though, has proven excellent investment, with costs coming down faster than even the optimists predicted. Nuclear power, meanwhile, which had been New Labour's preferred option, has significantly failed to demonstrate it can bring new reactors online on time and on budget, as well as failing to deal with the other problems. So what do environmental campaigners do following COP? Well, as I say, mostly the same as they would have done if there'd never been a COP. Keeping fossil fuels in the ground will be the main focus, coupled with targeting the main users of fossil fuels, such as power stations, airports, and internal combustion vehicles. That the Cambo oil field is actually in doubt through lack of finance, despite support from Westminster, gives campaigners hope. Climate justice will be another focus. Loss and damage will continue to be the main mechanism to achieve this, but campaigners will also try to get the industrialized nations to deliver on the promised 100 billion climate finance for developing nations that was promised in Paris. This money should have been in place by 2020, and the failure to deliver had a major impact at COP26, where the countries of the global south were asked to give up future fossil fuel use while suffering from the effects of the fossil fuels used to make the global north rich. Not only was the money not in place, but cuts to the UK's aid budget prior to the meeting destroyed any faith that rich nations were prepared to pay to fix the crisis they'd created. Biodiversity loss will also be a major campaigning focus. Here, the elephant in the room is meat eating. The amount of land needed to grow the soya to feed the animals the UK consumes for food is equal to the area of Northern Ireland. This land is mostly not in this country, as obviously there isn't room. And so the Amazon rainforest and Cerrado savanna regions of Brazil are being cleared. There was an agreement on deforestation agreed in Glasgow, but it was so weak that even arch climate villain President Bolsonaro of Brazil was happy to sign it. There are limits to what traditional campaigning methods can achieve, though. Environmental campaigners have had their greatest successes in stopping projects before they begin. No campaign has ever led to a profitable fossil fuel operation being shut down. However, stopping governments and corporations doing the wrong thing is very different from getting to do the right thing. Campaigners managed to get the government to support offshore wind when they stopped nuclear power scooping up the money earmarked for low carbon energy, but this was a rare victory. Unfortunately, the next items on the to-do list all require positive actions from government. We need to invest more in renewables, transition to electric vehicles, build better houses, insulate old houses, roll out heat pumps and build a smarter electric grid. We need to electrify everything. This will all take a plan, and it is very difficult to force a government to have a plan when it doesn't want to. Campaigners can take heart, though, from the huge shift in public opinion that has occurred over the last decade. Last year's TV drama The Trick told the story of ClimateGate, the hacked email scandal that derailed COP15. In 2009, it was possible to convince a significant number of people on scant evidence that climate change was a hoax. Today, we see strong belief in the soundness of the science and the necessity for action across the political spectrum in the UK. One sign of the changed political scene is that the infamous Tufton Street fake think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, has rebranded as Net Zero Watch and given up outright climate change denial. Another evidence of the shift in the public discussion of the climate emergency is the success of the Netflix film Don't Look Up, a mainstream star-studded movie that told its story with comedy and allegory and showed how the media and billionaire capitalists prevent action. Possibly, this is a start of a sort of the arts making powerful dramas about the climate crisis, and maybe, just maybe, this will change public perception in the way films like Brassed Off, The Full Monty and Billy Elliot changed public perception of deindustrialization in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher. Finally, 90% of campaigning is waiting for your opponent to give you the opening you need to beat them. And in the future, there'll be opportunities for action we can't predict at the moment. The law might be one of these. Individuals, groups, and even countries are already starting to take legal action against those responsible for the climate chaos. Maybe they'll start winning soon. Fossil fuel companies are also being taken to court under existing fraud legislation for hiding what they knew about climate change. New laws, such as the law of ecocide, are being proposed for the future. However, as things stand today, with the dust of COP26 having now settled, the situation does not look promising. The United Nations process looks too slow and too timid to produce the system change we require. Similarly, without a major gearing up of the scale of resistance by civil society, the actions of environmental groups tackling the sources of pollution one by one also look to be insufficient. It seems these two strands of action on the climate emergency will continue to run on parallel lines, the same only, and yet in that neither is yet solving the problem fast enough to prevent disaster. Thank you. Thank you.